They say the dust in that part of the country remembered things. They say it held the salt of tears and the iron of blood, and when the wind blew from the south, you could hear the whispers of ghosts haggling over the price of a human soul. In the summer of the great drought, when the sun baked the clay earth into a cracked and bleeding mosaic, the whispers grew loud. It was a bad time. A time for cruel men to prosper and for the desperate to be sold. Master Thorn, a man whose heart was as barren as his land, had decided to clear his ledgers. His assets, he called them. The women, heavy with child, were a poor investment. They were slow, they were a drain, and the children they carried were yet another mouth to feed until they were old enough to be put to work or sold themselves. So he held an auction. Not in the town square with a proper block and crier, but in the dusty, heat-shimmered yard of his own plantation, beneath a merciless sky. He called it a clearance. $7. That was the price he set. $7 for a life and the one it carried inside it. One by one, they were brought out. Women with rounded bellies and eyes that had learned not to hold any hope. Their names were called, their strengths listed in a voice stripped of all humanity. One by one, they were sold to grim-faced men who saw them not as mothers-to-be, but as a cheap bargain. A future field hand, already paid for. The dust swirled around their bare feet as they were led away, their shoulders slumped in a posture of final, crushing defeat. And then there was only one left. Ilara. She stood straighter than the others. Her chin was lifted, not in defiance, for she knew the futility of that, but in a silent refusal to be entirely broken. Her hands rested on the swell of her belly, a gesture that was both protective and proprietary. This child was hers, a small, secret truth in a world built on lies. The auctioneer, a greasy man in Thorn's employ, laughed. "What's the matter, gentlemen?" Last one of the lot. A bit proud, this one, but strong. Good hips. She'll give you another one next year. $7. Who'll give me 7? Silence answered him. The buyers had their fill. The sun beat down. A fly buzzed near the auctioneer's sweaty face. Master Thorn, watching from the shade of his porch, scowled. He cared not for the woman, only for the insult of the unsold goods. Just get rid of her, he grumbled, loud enough for all to hear. The auctioneer shrugged. No takers. Guess she's worth less than nothing. He looked at Ilara, his eyes filled with a casual cruelty. Maybe we just leave her for the buzzards. It was then that the man appeared. He hadn't been there before, or perhaps he had, standing so still at the edge of the scrub-choked tree line that he had seen part of the landscape, like a weathered stone or a dead tree. He was tall, dressed in worn, dark clothes that didn't belong to a planter or a farmhand. A wide-brimmed hat shadowed his face, but it could not hide the grim set of his jaw. He moved with a strange, quiet purpose, each step measured, his gaze fixed not on the auctioneer or on Thorn, but on Ilara. He walked past the remaining buyers, who shifted uneasily, and stopped before the makeshift block. He did not look like a man who had come for a bargain. There was an aura of cold stillness about him, the kind that precedes a storm. He carried no visible weapon, yet he seemed more dangerous than any man there. The auctioneer puffed out his chest. Well now. A latecomer to the festivities. $7 for the girl, friend. Last chance. The stranger said nothing. His eyes, the color of wet slate, lifted from Ilara to the auctioneer, then flickered to Thorn on the porch. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. Ilara watched him, her heart a trapped bird against her ribs. She saw the dust on his boots, the faint, silvered scar that traced the line of his jaw, the way his hands hung loose at his sides, relaxed but ready. He was not like the others. He looked at her, and for the first time that day, she felt she was seen as a person, not an object. His gaze was heavy with a sorrow she recognized, a deep, abiding grief that mirrored her own. Finally, he spoke. His voice was low and rough, like stones grinding together. I am not your friend. He turned his attention back to Ilara. He didn't ask her price. He didn't haggle. He reached into a worn leather pouch at his belt and drew out a single coin. It wasn't silver. It was gold. A heavy piece, gleaming with a dull, ancient light in the harsh sun. He tossed it through the air. The auctioneer, startled, fumbled and caught it. His eyes widened, his greed overpowering his fear. The coin was worth more than all the women sold that day combined. Thorn straightened on his porch, his eyes narrowed, calculating. The woman, the stranger said. It was not a request. It was a statement of fact. Thorn gave a curt nod. A deal was a deal, and this was a fine one. The stranger stepped forward and extended a hand to Elara. It was a large hand, calloused and scarred, but it was offered palm up, a gesture of invitation, not command. She hesitated. She had learned the hard way what a man's hand could mean. But his eyes held hers, and in their depths she saw not ownership, but something else. A promise. A refuge. After a lifetime of being taken, she was being asked. Slowly, her fingers trembling, she placed her hand in his. His grip was firm, solid, a tether in a world that had come undone. He helped her down from the block, his touch respectful. Without another word, without a backward glance at the men who had sought to own her, he led her away from the yard, away from the dust that remembered everything, and toward the horizon, where the sky was bruised purple with the coming evening. The journey was a silent one. The man, who she would later learn was named Silas, did not speak. He walked just ahead of her, setting a pace that was slow and deliberate, mindful of her condition. The sun dipped below the cracked horizon, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and red before surrendering to a deep, star-dusted indigo. The air grew cool, a blessed relief after the oppressive heat of the day. He had a horse, a lean, wiry animal that carried their few supplies. He had offered her the saddle, but she had refused, shaking her head. To ride while he walked felt like an acceptance of a debt she could never repay. So they walked, two solitary figures moving through a vast, indifferent landscape. When the moon rose, a sliver of bone white in the dark, he finally stopped. He chose a spot sheltered by a small rock outcropping. He built a fire with an economy of motion that spoke of long practice, the flames catching quickly, pushing back the encroaching shadows. He offered her a water skin, and she drank deeply, the cool water a balm to her parched throat. He shared his food, a piece of hardtack and some dried meat, without a word. Elara ate, her eyes never leaving him. She studied him in the flickering firelight, trying to piece together the puzzle of who he was. He was not a soft man. The lines on his face were carved by hardship, his expression perpetually grim, as if he were forever gazing upon some past tragedy. When he removed his hat, she saw his hair was dark, streaked with grey at the temples, though he did not seem old. He moved with the quiet grace of a predator, yet his actions toward her were marked by a profound gentleness. He finished his meal and stared into the fire, his thoughts 1,000 miles away. Elara drew her thin shawl tighter around her shoulders. The silence was not empty, it was filled with unspoken questions, with the weight of their shared strangeness. "Thank you," she said, her voice raspy from disuse. It was the first thing she had said to him. Silas turned his head slowly, his slate-grey eyes meeting hers across the flames. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. "Rest," he said. It was all the answer she received. He laid out a bedroll for her near the fire's warmth and then took up a position a short distance away, his back against the rock, a blanket pulled over his shoulders. He did not lie down. He sat watch, his gaze sweeping the darkness, a silent guardian against a world of threats. Elara lay down, but she did not sleep for a long time. She listened to the chirping of the crickets and the soft sigh of the wind. She watched the unmoving silhouette of the man who had bought her freedom with a single gold coin. She did not understand him. She did not know if he was a savior or simply a different kind of captor. But as she finally drifted into an exhausted sleep, she knew one thing for certain: when he looked at her, he did not see property. They traveled for 3 more days. The landscape changed, the flat, scorched earth giving way to rolling hills dotted with stubborn green foliage. They came to a creek, its water running clear and cold over smooth stones. Silas led them along its bank, deeper into the wilderness, far from any established road. The air grew cleaner, scented with pine and damp earth. On the third day, as the afternoon sun filtered through a thick canopy of leaves, they arrived. His home was not a house, but a cabin. It was small and sturdy, built of rough-hewn logs, nestled so perfectly into the side of a wooded hill that it seemed to have grown there. A thin curl of smoke rose from a stone chimney, suggesting he had not planned to be away long. A small, neatly tended garden grew in a patch of cleared land, and the sound of the nearby creek was a constant, soothing murmur. It was the most peaceful place Ilara had ever seen. Silas stopped at the door and turned to her. For a moment, he seemed uncertain. "This is it," he said, his voice quiet. He pushed the heavy wooden door open, revealing a single, sparsely furnished room. It was clean and orderly. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, a simple wooden table and 2 chairs sat in the center, and a bed was tucked into a corner, covered with a thick patchwork quilt. On a small shelf sat a few books and a single, small, carved wooden horse, worn smooth by time. He gestured toward the bed. "You take this." Ilara hesitated at the threshold, her hand instinctively going to her belly. "I will not be a burden," she said, her pride a fragile shield. "I can work." His eyes softened for a fraction of a second, a flicker of warmth in their stony depths. "Your work," he said, his gaze dropping to her hands resting on her stomach, "is to care for the child." He took the blankets from the bed and placed them on the floor near the hearth. "This will do for me." He did not wait for an argument. He went outside to unsaddle the horse, leaving her standing in the doorway of her new reality. She stepped inside. The air smelled of wood smoke and pine. It smelled safe. That night, she lay in the bed, the quilt warm and heavy over her. Across the room, Silas slept on the floor, a dark shape in the faint moonlight filtering through the single window. Sometime in the deep of the night, a sound woke her. A low moan, thick with pain. She sat up, her heart pounding. It was coming from Silas. He was caught in a nightmare, his body tense, his hands clenched into fists. He muttered a name, a woman's name, choked with anguish. "Sarah." "I'm sorry." Ilara watched, her breath held. The stoic, unreadable man was gone, replaced by someone lost in a private hell. She saw his scars then, not just the one on his jaw, but the deeper ones he carried within him. He was as wounded as she was. And in that moment, in the quiet of the remote cabin, a fragile tendril of understanding began to grow between them, a silent acknowledgement of their shared status as survivors. The days settled into a quiet rhythm, measured by the rising and setting of the sun. Silas was a man of routine. He rose before dawn, tending to the garden and checking the snares he set for game. He chopped wood with a steady, powerful swing of the axe, the sound echoing through the small valley. He moved with a purpose that left no room for idleness. Ilara found her own routines. She swept the cabin's wooden floor, cooked their meals over the hearth, and mended their clothes with small, neat stitches. At first, they moved around each other like 2 wary animals, their silence a buffer zone. She would leave his food on the table and he would eat it after she had taken her own portion to her seat by the window. They spoke only when necessary, their words clipped and functional. "The water pail is low, I will fetch it. There is stew, thank you." But silence, in a space so small, can become a language of its own. She learned to read him not by his words, but by the set of his shoulders, the tension in his jaw. She knew when his thoughts were dark, when the ghosts of his past walked with him. He, in turn, learned her rhythms. He saw the moments of weariness that she tried to hide, the way she would pause and press a hand to her back. One morning, he left a stool he had fashioned from a stump just outside the cabin door, a place for her to sit and shell peas in the morning sun without having to stand. He said nothing about it. He just left it there. She said nothing in return, but she used it every day. Her trust in him grew slowly, like a seed planted in hard soil. It was nurtured not by grand gestures, but by 1,000 small acts of quiet consideration. He never entered her half of the room without a soft knock on the wall. He always left the largest portion of food for her. When she stumbled on the uneven path to the creek, his hand was there, steadying her arm, and then retreating as soon as she had her balance. He treated her not with the cloying pity she despised, but with a deep, abiding respect that was more precious than any kindness. One evening, as she sat mending one of his shirts, she looked at the worn fabric, the seams strained by the power of the man who wore it. He was sitting at the table, sharpening a knife with a whetstone, the rhythmic scrape the only sound in the room. "Who was Sarah?" she asked, the words leaving her mouth before she could stop them. The scraping stopped. The silence that followed was heavy, cold. She thought he would not answer, that she had trespassed on a sacred sorrow. He set the knife down with precise care. His gaze was fixed on the blade, but his mind was far away. "My wife," he said, his voice a low whisper. He did not say more, but Ilara understood. The carved horse on the shelf, the nightmares, the impenetrable sadness in his eyes, it all clicked into place. He was a man hollowed out by loss. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her own losses a dull ache in her chest. He looked up, his eyes meeting hers. She would have liked you," he said, and the admission seemed to cost him something. She was strong. Like you that night, the space between them felt a little smaller. A few weeks later, as the first hints of autumn began to tinge the leaves with gold, she found it on the small table beside her bed. A bird. It was carved from a single piece of pale wood, its wings half spread as if in mid-flight. It was simple, yet so exquisitely detailed that she could almost feel the texture of its feathers. She picked it up, her fingers tracing the smooth, flowing lines. It was a gift for the baby. She looked over at Silas, who was watching the fire, pretending not to notice her. A feeling bloomed in her chest, warm and unfamiliar. It was gratitude, but it was more than that. It was a fragile, burgeoning affection. She did not thank him with words. Instead, the next day, she took the worn quilt from her bed, the one she knew he had made, and spent the afternoon painstakingly repairing a frayed patch with a piece of cloth from one of her old dresses. She folded it and left it on his blankets by the hearth. That evening, when he lay down to sleep, he ran his hand over the patch, his rough fingers tracing the pattern of her stitches. And in the darkness, where she could not see him, a faint, sad smile touched his lips. He began to teach her things. He showed her which plants were medicine and which were poison. He taught her how to read the tracks of deer and rabbit in the soft earth by the creek. "You need to know the land," he told her, his voice earnest. "The land will provide. But it will also warn you he was not just protecting her, he was empowering her. He was giving her the tools for survival, ensuring that she would never be helpless again." One afternoon, he attempted to bake bread. The result was a charred, rock-hard loaf that filled the cabin with acrid smoke. He stood over it, looking utterly defeated, a smear of flour on his cheek. Ilara, despite herself, let out a small laugh. The sound was rusty, foreign, but it was real. Silas looked up, startled. And then he saw the humor in it. A slow smile spread across his face, crinkling the corners of his eyes. It was the first time she had seen him truly smile, and it transformed his harsh features, revealing a glimpse of the man he might have been before the world broke him. In that shared moment of levity, something shifted permanently. They were no longer just two strangers sharing a roof. They were becoming something else. Something like family. The change began subtly, as the first cold wind of late autumn snaked its way down from the northern ridges. It was a shift in the air, a different quality to the silence of the woods. The birds seemed to sing a more frantic tune, and the squirrels scurried with a desperate haste. Silas felt it first. It was an old instinct, a primal sense of being watched that had kept him alive in places where death was a constant companion. He became quieter, more watchful. His hand strayed more often to the worn handle of the large hunting knife he always wore at his belt. Ilara noticed the change in him. The rare smiles vanished, and the grim mask of the warrior returned. He spent less time on chores and more time patrolling the perimeter of their small valley, his eyes scanning the ridgelines, his posture taut with attention that seeped into the very atmosphere of the cabin. "What is it?" she asked one evening, her voice low. They were sitting by the fire, the flames casting long, dancing shadows on the log walls. He had been staring into the embers for an hour without moving. He didn't look at her, but continued to gaze into the fire as if seeking an answer there. "The wind is carrying a new scent," he said cryptically. "Something rotten." He began to prepare. He checked his supplies, cleaned the old rifle he kept wrapped in oilcloth and hidden beneath a loose floorboard, and counted his ammunition. He reinforced the cabin door with a heavy new bar. His movements were calm and methodical, but beneath the surface, Ilara could feel a cold, lethal purpose. He gave her a small, sharp knife. The blade was clean and bright. "Keep this with you," he said, his voice flat. Always she took it, the cold steel a heavy, frightening weight in her hand. "Who is coming, Silas?" He finally met her eyes, and the look in them made her breath catch. It was a look of grim certainty, of a man facing an old and hated enemy. "Trouble you thought you left behind," he said. "Men like Thorn don't forget a slight. And they don't forget the value of a gold coin." Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through the fragile peace she had built. Thorn. The name was a venomous whisper from a past she had prayed was buried. She thought of his cruel eyes, his contemptuous sneer. The idea of him finding her here, in this sanctuary, was a violation that made her feel ill. For days, the tension mounted. Every snap of a twig in the woods, every hoot of an owl, sent a jolt of alarm through her. But Silas remained a pillar of calm resolve. He was no longer just the grieving widower, he was the soldier, the protector. He was ready. The warning came, as he knew it would, from the land itself. One afternoon, a flock of crows burst from the trees on the far ridge, cawing in alarm. A moment later, the deer that often grazed in the meadow by the creek bolted and vanished into the deep woods. A profound silence fell, the kind that precedes violence. Silas, who had been splitting firewood, went still. He dropped the axe and walked swiftly to the cabin. His face was a granite mask. "They're here," he said, his voice devoid of all emotion. "Get inside. Bar the door. No matter what you hear, you do not open it. You do not make a sound. Go to the corner, behind the bed. Stay low." He looked at her, his eyes filled with a fierce, protective light. He reached out and cupped her cheek, his thumb brushing her skin. It was the most intimate gesture he had ever made. "I will not let them harm you," he vowed. Or the child. He pressed a small, leather-bound book into her hand. It was the book from his shelf. "If I don't..." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. He turned and strode out of the cabin, pulling the heavy door shut behind him. Ilara's hands trembled as she slid the thick wooden bar into place. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She clutched the knife and the book to her chest and did as he said, crouching in the far corner, making herself as small as possible. Through a tiny crack in the chinking between the logs, she could see the clearing. Silas was not there. He had melted into the trees, becoming one with the shadows. She waited. The silence was agonizing. Then she heard them. The jingle of harnesses, the thud of horses' hooves, the low, coarse laughter of men who believed they held all the power. The riders emerged from the trees, Master Thorn at their lead. He looked smug, his face flushed with triumph. He reined his horse in and surveyed the small, quiet cabin as if it were already his. "He can't have gone far," Thorn called out, his voice echoing in the unnaturally quiet valley. "The woman is here. I can smell her. Flush them out." One of his men, a burly, bearded man, dismounted and swaggered toward the cabin door. "Come on out, girlie," he taunted. "Master's come to take you home." He reached for the door handle. From the trees to the man's right, something moved. It was too fast to be human. A dark shape, a glint of steel. There was a choked gasp. The burly man stiffened, his eyes wide with surprise, a look of confusion on his face. He brought a hand to his throat, and it came away dark with blood. Then he crumpled to the ground without another sound. The other men shouted in alarm, drawing their pistols, their eyes darting wildly toward the trees. Thorn cursed, his face losing its smugness, replaced by a snarl of fury. "He's in the trees." "Show yourself, you coward." Silence was his only answer. The valley held its breath. Then, from the opposite side of the clearing, a rifle shot cracked the air. Another of Thorn's men cried out and toppled from his saddle. Panic erupted. The remaining man fired his pistol blindly into the woods. Thorn, his face pale with a mixture of rage and fear, spurred his horse around, using it as a shield. "You will pay for this," he screamed. "That woman is my property. I have a bill of sale." From the shadows near the creek, Silas's voice emerged, cold and clear as the water itself. "She is not property. And your bill is paid." The clearing became a crucible of violence. The remaining henchman, panicked, charged his horse toward the spot where Silas's voice had come from, firing his pistol wildly. Another rifle shot, sharper and more precise than the last, echoed from a different location. The man jerked in his saddle as if struck by an invisible fist and fell heavily to the ground. The horse, spooked, galloped away into the woods. Now it was just Thorn. He was alone, his bravado stripped away, leaving only the raw, ugly core of his cowardice. He wheeled his horse around, his eyes wide and frantic, scanning the silent, watching trees. The hunter had become the hunted. Silas stepped out from behind a large oak tree, the rifle held loosely in one hand. He was no longer hiding. He stood in the open, a figure of implacable judgment. His face was calm, his eyes as cold as a winter river. "It's over, Thorn," Silas said, his voice carrying easily across the clearing. "Leave." And never return. Thorn's fear curdled into a desperate, hateful rage. "You think you can take what is mine," he shrieked, his voice cracking. "That whore and her bastard belong to me. I'll burn this place to the ground with you in it." In a fit of mad fury, Thorn kicked his horse and charged, not at Silas, but at the cabin. He drew a pistol, his intent clear: if he could not have his property, he would destroy it. Inside, Ilara heard the thunder of hooves coming directly toward her. She scrambled back, pressing herself against the log wall, her mind screaming. The door shuddered, groaning under the impact of Thorn's shoulder as he threw himself against it. "I know you're in there, you bitch," he roared. The wood splintered. Silas moved. He did not run. He moved with a terrifying, fluid speed, closing the distance in a few long, silent strides. He dropped the rifle and drew the long knife from his belt. As Thorn reared back to slam against the door again, Silas was upon him. He vaulted onto the side of Thorn's horse, grabbing the man by the collar and hauling him from the saddle. They hit the ground together in a tangle of limbs. Thorn, flailing, managed to fire his pistol. The shot went wide, burying itself in a log of the cabin wall, just inches from where Ilara cowered. The sound was deafening in the small space. Thorn was no match for Silas. He was a soft man, used to others doing his dirty work. Silas was a man forged in fire and loss. The struggle was brief and brutal. It ended with a final, desperate gasp from Thorn, and then a profound silence. Ilara, her heart pounding in her throat, risked a glance through the crack in the wall. She saw Silas kneeling on the ground, his back to her. Thorn lay still beside him. Silas remained kneeling for a long moment, his head bowed, his shoulders heaving with the force of his breathing. The violence was over. The valley was quiet again, but it was a wounded quiet, stained by what had just happened. Slowly, painfully, Silas pushed himself to his feet. He was limping, and his left arm hung at an odd angle. He had not escaped unscathed. He turned toward the cabin, his face etched with pain and exhaustion. He looked like a man who had visited hell and barely made it back. Ilara's hands shook as she fumbled with the bar on the door. It slid free with a heavy thud. She pulled the door open and stumbled out into the fading light. The scene before her was grim: the bodies, the churned-up earth, the smell of gunpowder and blood. But her eyes were only for Silas. He stood there, swaying slightly, his gaze fixed on her. He saw that she was safe, that the child was safe, and a wave of relief so powerful it was almost painful washed over his features. She ran to him, her fear for his safety overriding everything else. She reached him just as his legs gave out. She caught him, her slight frame struggling to support his weight, and eased him to the ground. "Silas," she whispered, her voice choked with tears. She saw the dark stain spreading on his sleeve, the gash on his leg where Thorn's spur must have caught him. Without hesitation, she began to tend to him. She tore a strip from her petticoat to stanch the bleeding in his arm, her movement swift and sure. The woman who had been terrified of a raised voice was now calmly dressing the wounds of a man who had just killed for her. The wall that had stood between them, built of his grief and her fear, had been shattered. In the crucible of violence, their shared survival had forged a bond stronger than any words. She worked in silence, cleaning his wounds with water from the creek, her touch gentle but firm. He watched her, his expression unguarded for the first time. The hardness was gone, replaced by a raw vulnerability. When she was finished, she sat back on her heels, her hand stained with his blood. The sun had set, and the first stars were appearing in the twilight sky. "He's gone," Silas said, his voice raspy. "They're all gone." "You are safe now," she looked at him, her eyes shining in the dim light. "We are safe," she corrected him softly. He reached out with his good hand and took hers. His grip was weak, but it was full of a meaning that transcended the horrors of the day. He held her hand and looked at the cabin, at the small garden, at the peaceful valley that was now truly theirs. He finally told her everything then. He told her about Sarah, and about their own small son, taken by a fever while he was away fighting in a war he no longer believed in. He spoke of his guilt, a burden he had carried for years, believing he had failed to protect them. "I saw you on that block," he whispered, his eyes filled with a profound emotion. "And I saw her. I saw a chance to do it right. To protect what matters." He looked at her, at the gentle swell of her belly, at the strength in her eyes that had called to him from the very beginning. "This is your home now, Ilara," he said, his voice thick with feeling. "If you will have it." "If you will have me." Tears streamed down her face, but they were not tears of sorrow. She squeezed his hand. "We are home," she said. A life was beginning, born from the ashes of two broken pasts. The child within her stirred, a gentle kick, a promise of the future. And as the moon rose over the valley, bathing it in a soft, healing light, the storyteller's whispers on the wind spoke not of ghosts and bargains, but of redemption, and of a love that had been vowed, and would be kept, forever.